Hey guys, so I wanted to run you through this SERUM Reese patch I've made, which relies 95% on the synth itself and very little on the post-processing. On the last stage here, I did do a little bit of compression and distortion just to make it a little bit more crunchy, but the core of the sound comes from just using SERUM, and it's pretty powerful inbuilt effects tools and a few little cheeky techniques that work quite nice to get some crunch and some movement on the sound. So this is the sound itself. So there's only a few automations on there, and they're just more for like slight variation, really. Even without those, the sound, the core of it, again, 95% of it is there already. That slight automation stuff is just fairly early on in the chain of events, just to slightly modulate stuff and have each note sound quite nice and different. So I broke it down into various stages, so it's a little bit more digestible. We'll start with the first. So it's all the same MIDI and the same notes. I actually removed a note just at the end there, just for some drama. But yeah, it's all the same stuff. So obviously pretty basic, and you'll notice obviously the crunch is not there at all. The reason I've done that is to basically, and we'll dive into the SERUM patch now, I guess. It's a saw wave, as you'd imagine, for a resound. The filter at the start of it is basically creating a nice little transient at the front of the sound, giving it a little click, and basically separates the front of the sound from the body of it. In frequency and in volume, I guess, to have a spike in the top end and the mids right at the start, and in the volume of it means that when we push the sound into distortions, the very front of the sound will sound slightly different to the rest of it, and they'll separate the two. And that is really important, I think, for creating this really dramatic like start point to each sound. It makes it a lot easier to mix a sound when it actually has like a I begin now kind of thing, like a confident start point. In terms of making riffs out of it, each new note is going to have this confident start point, which I know it sounds like a bit weird to keep going over on that same point, but it makes a big difference having a Reese that is going to cut through nicely. A lot of the character of the sound is that kind of sweep and that kick right at the start. And you can do it in post, like resampling stuff, but it's easiest to, if you know that you're trying to achieve that result, to start there. So yeah, the only things going on here really is, I've got basic shapes up. You can find in analog and then basic shapes. I've just found the saw, and then the first thing I do is take random off on the oscillator options here, so that we have the same sound every time. This makes it a lot easier to work with. You can change the phase of it to get slightly different results. Certainly when you're doing this frequency, this pitch bend thing, which I like to do with one of the LFOs in envelope mode here. I pretty much always go straight to the matrix and have an LFO on envelope mode assigned to master tune. I've actually got this exact shape saved. I'm going to play back with the LFO 4 here and use that on a pitch to kind of recreate it for you, but then you'll see why I've done this exact shape, because it's quite important that it's done right. So I'm going to go all the way up to 100 with it. I turn off the original one so that we're playing with 4 now. So this is the envelope affecting the pitch. Let's take off we'll keep on the filter for a second. I'll explain what I did with that in more detail in a sec. So let's go into LFO 4. If we just assign it straight up, the type is on, I guess it's called like omnidirectional or something, where it goes to the left of a middle point and to the right of it. In this case, the middle point is our original pitch, and then this LFO is now going above it and below it, which is problematic if you want it to stay on the same note that it was originally. So if we listen to this now, again, envelope mode. So it should just do a quick sweep down, and you would hope it would land on our original note, but it'll actually go below. So we need to put that onto unidirectional, or just like the arrow going to the right. So now I should just go. So this really weird thing is happening. Let me turn the sound up just for a minute here. This happens in quite a few synths, not all, but certainly in SERUM and Phase Plant as well. It's nice and obvious here, actually. It's lingering on the top note long enough that it's actually creating its own pitch. It should just be as the shape would describe, sliding down in a linear fashion all the way. But it's actually sticking up there, so long that even my analyzer here is picking up a mew. It's bizarre. I don't know what happens, but basically I try and counteract that with the shape. So what I do is on LFO 2 here, the very first portion of the sound is much quicker than the rest. So this is the kind of the low end boom that you want to feel, and this is the top end kind of spike. And yeah, I've kind of, if you imagine that time is going from left to right here, most of the pitch bend is happening like ludicrously quickly, and then it slows down for the rest, and that allows you to kind of hear this more clicky and boomy pitch bend kind of thing. Need to turn that up. Hey. Yeah, so it creates this really nice kind of like almost like a kick drum thing. And if you don't do that, yeah, you get that really annoying pitch lingering thing. If anyone knows why that happens, please let me know. So I'm going to put this onto constant and turn it off just for the sake of visual cleanness. And the only other thing going on here is LFO 3, again in envelope mode. Similar technique here. I'm just going to get rid of this modulation, which we don't need. And this isn't to counteract anything, this is just a kind of a nice shape. Basically, the body of the sound wants to have a fairly nice decay. Again, this change over time is going to force the sound to, when pushed into distortions and compressions and stuff, you will get slightly different levels of all the frequencies, and that's going to create a sound that moves over time and creates, maybe it gets more crunchy as it goes on, or maybe the bass increases, all that kind of stuff. These slight modulations at the beginning of the sound make a huge difference when you're relying on distortions and stuff to create the character of your Reese. So yeah, even small changes can make a dramatic effect at the end. The envelope does a very quick dip from like having all frequencies pretty much to halfway down, so we get this kind of low pass Reese feel. If I was to bring this down, so this is a nice start point. What we're going to do is create all the crunch and the top end using probably some OTT within SERUM and the multi-band compression thing, and some distortion as well. But again, having this start point of creating contrast between the transient and the body of the sound really makes a big difference. It allows it to have this smack in the end. Sweet. So that's pretty much it for the first round. Nice and basic. Cool, so on to step 2. So let's see what's changed here. So a fair amount more modulation going on. The top end has been brought back via some distortion and some compression. We've got some FM going on, there's a bit of noise, and there's a few plugins on the old effects. So yeah, a fair amount to go through. Let's have a look at the FM first. So I'm going to turn the unison off and the noise, and maybe turn the effects off. Let's just see what we're left with. Sweet, so we've got some slight detuning going on here. I want to control the way in which this is done rather than just slap on some chorus, for instance. So the reason we're doing this FM stuff is to create some slight phasing and some grit in the sound, but we want to control how and when that happens. So I've got oscillator beat on, another saw wave at the same pitch, but just moved up by 35 on the sense, so it's like a little bit detuned. The level of it is actually off completely, so it's just we're using it as a modulator only, basically using it to affect and change our original oscillator, but not to actually be heard by itself. And as I'm sure you know, in order to FM something from B, you go onto the old FM from B option down here. And then we've got LFO 4, moving that at a fairly slow rate, just to A-B that. Again, it's subtle, but if you A-B this toward the end, when you've got all the processing that is reliant on this slight movement, then yeah, it makes a big difference. So we're getting all the benefits of the kind of movement when it's at its top value there, but then it does duck back down to the more controlled and less detuned version quite often, so that you dip into the detuned one, but never for long enough where it sounds messy. It's kind of the best of both situations. Cool. So the next step was to, let's turn these four back on. Sounding quite nice already. These effects then, let's go on to those. Distortion. First of all, diode settings, one of my favorites. I just drove it all the way up, mix all the way at 100, just giving us some fatness. And then you have the flanger and dimension expander. They're kind of just used to create some slight stereo field with the dimension expander, which is kind of like a small reverb. If I put the size really far up here, you can hear how that sounds like a room reverb. When the size is really small, it kind of creates a really, really close kind of like ambience thing. When the mix is right, it sounds quite nice. I quite often like to leave the OTT setting, which is kind of inbuilt into the compressor, on at the end of the chain and then tweak the things before it. Often it's a good end plugin to have to kind of raise everything to level, bring your top end back and all that other jazz. So mix on full with that, and then yeah, I'm playing with the stuff before it. So let's play with the flanger now. You're kind of just trying to find that sweet spot of like where it's not lame, but it's added a good bit of like slight modulation to the sound. So I like 40% typically with the SERUM ones. Nothing crazy going on with the parameters here. I've just got the rate at like a not too fast, you know. So that's kind of it for the processing at this level. We'll do some more on the next stage, but it's basically the same setup, just with a few more modulations stuck in between the distortion and the compressor. So back to the oscillator. I went to 8 unison with this one. Because the randomization is off, we're going to get like the same start point of all oscillators. They do detune them, obviously. All the 8 different oscillators are at slightly different pitches, which means that we are going to get to this kind of cool phase sweep. If that were to be on like a long note, might be particularly obvious. You get this kind of thing going on. But if you change the phase point, the phase restart, like we will do with some automation in a bit, we will find that you get some nice modulation, and it doesn't sound like the same kind of lasery every time. So this is what it would sound like. Let's take that pitch bend off it. So just to kind of A/B that with how it could sound if you had the randomization on, sorry. Quite different every time, rather than getting the same every time. It's useful. We will automate the phase restart point, as I said, and the detune to get some variation, but I like to be in control of those two across the riff, rather than having them just randomly restart every time. For instance, having higher notes at like a wider detune. That kind of thing. It just gives you some more control and some more expression in the sound. So on to the next thing. We've got some noise. Obviously, this is like early chain, so you have the kind of the chain of events would be that you create the sounds with sub, oscillator A, B, and noise, and then they run into the filter and then into the effects chain. And I turn the filter back on to create that transient. The noise will be more obvious when we've turned everything up again. Particularly when you layer on the distortions at the end, which really bring up the top end. Even small things early in the chain have a big effect at the end. I keep saying that, but it's important. Cool. So stage 3. Let's have a listen. I'm going to turn up the top end, just because it sounds, in contrast to before where we've got loads, it sounds like it's a step back. We will take this off again for the processing that we have at the end. Cool. So we've got a few things automating now. Let's have a look into those just really quickly. So it's the unison detune. First of all, again, higher notes having a wider detune sounds quite cool. I just found some fun little, there's not a particular science to this. I found that this sounded quite nice. It might be cool to have that note, for instance, go crazy detuned. Just see what that might sound like as an example. Zoom in. As opposed to if we turn the detune off at that moment. Obviously, it's totally to taste what sounds good to you. And then the phase, again, because the whole chain is reliant on the kind of the setup of oscillators here, small phase movements will create quite a lot of modulation across it as well. So again, I've just done like an up and down thing that sounded good. Obviously, there are moments where things go too far. You want to pull those back. Obviously, having a full detune sounds kind of whack. Maybe a little bit more on that one there. Yeah. So let's go into the actual patch then. So there is a few more things on the effects chain, which we'll just dive into. So we've got a little bit more top end on the EQ prior to everything. Again, this is like the placement of plugins isn't always chronological. Like in this case, that we had distortion first before, and then on the next stage, later in the process, I realized that actually a little bit of EQ change earlier in the chain helped. You don't always have to work, stacking up on top. Often going back and tweaking things is a really useful way to do things. And as I said, rearranging the building blocks can be a really good way of getting slightly better results from stuff. I like to make saves all the time to make sure that I'm never losing a good sound by tweaking something early and not being able to go back to it, because that is a nightmare. So I've got a bit of EQ. There is another filter just before the compressor and everything. The compressor will probably compress the top so much that we still have that grit. But again, I just wanted to force a little bit more contrast between the transient and the body of the sound. And I've also added a phaser. Again, low, dry, wet, slow on the rate. Just creating a little bit more modulation. A little bit slower on the rate there. See, with that, I just felt like I had too much top end. Obviously, the EQ there is compensating slightly for the fact that I've got a filter on here, but that movement right at the start, if you concentrate on the kind of kick here, on the start of each note, compared to this, much more defined. And then when we distort and get our tops back later, we will be grateful. And then some chorus at the end. This is a last minute thing. I've got it on low pass mode, and this is basically giving me a little bit more bottom end and mids, which again, working into the distortions on stage 4, sound a bit better. Cool, so stage 4 is the same patch exactly, but with some post-processing. So let's dive into that one. Same there. So yeah, the post, it's pretty simple stuff. There's not a lot going on. It looks a little bit more complex than it is, but it's, it's 4 plugins really. More tops, not much to explain there. I just want a little bit more grit on the top end. Loving that first note. I did do some slight MIDI pitch bend stuff. I wanted a little bit more scoop out of this note. You can also change the rate on the pitch bend to get some cool results. So if we have a look on here, LFO2 rate is the LFO that we assign to the pitch bend. That, if you slow it down, basically the pitch bend happens over a longer period, and you get like a ooh rather than like a ooh. It's a slightly longer pitch bend, which can be a bit more dramatic. It depends if the note is long enough to sustain that, if that makes sense. If you're rhythm is like down, 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 down. You might have it where if you try and have the LFO rate too slow, that the note isn't long enough for the full pitch bend to happen, and what you have there is that the actual note it's supposed to be was never played. So musically, it becomes like, what is the riff now? If that whole note is just like a so you got to bear that in mind. This riff's fairly slow moving, so those longer notes you can really get away with like a rather than like an instant right the note. See how this last note's not that powerful right now? By itself it is, but when played straight after this one, it doesn't sound quite as awesome. So I might want to, at the very start of this note, slow down the LFO2 rate so we get some pow on it. Too much pow. And then really slow. See how that's got no power? It's got a little kind of click of high end, but nothing beneath it. And when you do it properly. Sweet. So EQ, this Ableton Saturate is awesome. I like using that at various stages at a fairly low dry wet. Just driving a little bit on the old hard curve. There's a lot of buttons here that I never use. Pretty much just drive, change the type, and then the dry wet. There's an OTT, which was originally at the end of the chain, and again I've slotted stuff in between it. OTT is really good at bringing up even small events in the high end, so if you can introduce noise early on, and like a vocoded layer, which we're about to go through, then the OTT really kind of exaggerates those processes. And then at the end, another bit of saturation. I think I just copied it over and changed the distortion type, and then an OTT at the end, just because it's a good plugin. So, oh yeah, a little note, when you're using the external version of the OTT, low amounts. 100 sounds awful. Well, maybe not. Usually it does anyway. So yeah, go easy on that. The only interesting thing here going on is this parallel vocode chain. So this is the original. This is the vocoded version. So this thing's really good at getting loads of texture. If you have it on the carrier mode noise, it basically tries to recreate your sound with as many bands as it has, and yeah, it splits the frequency spectrum into that many chunks, 40 in this case that I've chosen it to be. It looks at the volume and the kind of the volume envelope of that frequency band, and it tries to replicate it with noise. And if you do it really, really quickly, like with the attack and release settings I've got here, then you get quite like a textured, ripply thing going on. And if it's before some distortion and some OTT, it kind of combines with the sound really nicely. Obviously, you want to play it in parallel to the actual original. But yeah, it sounds really cool. And I'm just moving the formant, which is kind of the pitch of it, up and down for some modulation quite dramatically. So that's just this automation here. No science to it. I was just kind of like maybe higher notes at a higher pitch on here, but not necessarily. It just all sounds quite cool. See how even a tiny bit of noise there makes it a lot more crunchy. So there you have it. Mainly SERUM doing the heavy lifting and then a little bit of post-processing. I like to save these racks as if you have worked into it with a reasonable reshape, distortion and compression and that kind of thing will work similarly on similarly EQ'd content, if that makes sense. If you're throwing into this chain a fairly similar shape to the one that worked before, it will work similarly. I've said that word a lot now, and will work quite nicely. So saving those racks, rearranging them in order is a great way of getting new results quickly. Thanks for watching, and I hope this was a useful and interesting vid. Cool. See you later.